Chapter 315, Abram, 2. Eugene couldn't help but wear a half-dazed expression. Presently he was floating above the royal castle of Aroth, Abram itself. The magic ceiling formation embedded in the entire massive fortress rendered all wizards powerless except the royal family and the court magicians. Moreover, its power extended not just inside the fortress but also outside. Other wizards couldn't fly above Abram. All magical attacks from outside were also nullified by the magic ceiling formation. But despite that, Eugene was hovering in the airspace above Abram effortlessly. The reason he could do so was simple. It was Sienna who had created the magic ceiling formation and the surrounding lake. Sienna extended Akasha forward and closed her eyes. The eternal hole activated, and the boundless mana contained within Akasha was guided into it. Ignoring the ceiling magic circle, Sienna captured the chunk of land known as Abram with her spell. Kugagung. The entire fortress jumped and moved. Massive ripples began to form on the previously calm surface of the lake. The ripples soon became waves which started to swash against the fortress. Hey, you're still recovering, don't push yourself, Eugene reminded. This isn't straining at all, Sienna chuckled, lifting Akasha a little higher. It would have taken a definite toll if she were to use a completely new spell. However, moving Abram was not particularly difficult for Sienna. The magic she had cast hundreds of years ago was still intact. The same was true for the magic ceiling formation, as well as the magic that allowed the fortress to float above the lake. This was all the magic Sienna had cast and engraved in the past. The formulae she had inscribed hundreds of years ago had barely changed. Future generations of wizards had come to comprehend and develop the magic ceiling formation to a certain extent, but no one had directly interfered with the dense inscriptions etched onto the huge fortress. It was a daunting, dangerous task even for archwizards. What if they inadvertently triggered a fatal error? A mistake like that would cost even an archwizard their life. Abram began to sink, though very, very slowly. This was precisely why she had said it wouldn't be straining for her. Lifting an object of such weight into the air would definitely have been strenuous, but subtly altering the pre-existing magic that made the object float to make it sink into the lake wasn't a huge task. As Abram slowly sank, the waves of the lake became more violent. The overflowing waves battered the pristine white castle walls and the open castle gates connected to the river. It was literally a water burial. It was a joke that had been made in the past during a hearing. But clearly, Sienna actually intended to bury Abram underwater. Shouldn't he stop her at this point? Eugene thought as he glanced at Sienna's face. If Sienna was wearing an emotional expression, he would have tried to stop her, verbally at least. But on the contrary, Sienna's face was incredibly calm. She looked nonchalant, almost as if she were just carrying out an ordinary chore. She wasn't doing this out of shallow excitement or anger. Sienna was extremely calm and composed. She had first heard about it from Eugene a few years ago. Then she had contemplated once more after being released from her seal a month ago. However, the conclusion was unchanged. Converting her mansion into a tourist site? Clearing the small forest and filling up the river? Such things were annoying, but it was somewhat inevitable, considering that 200 years had passed since she went into seclusion without a word. Meridian Square and the statue? They were embarrassing indeed, but not a cause for anger. However, having persecuted Mare was something to be angered about. It was an unforgivable act. What Sienna could not tolerate the most was that despite proclaiming her as the wise Sienna and making her the idol of wizards over hundreds of years, they had not treated Mare, the familiar she personally created, with the respect she deserved. Of course, Sienna was not blameless in this matter either. She had linked Mare with witchcraft in Akron. So ultimately, it was technically Sienna's fault that Mare had been trapped in Akron for hundreds of years. Even so, dissecting her? The least they could have done was to modify the hall for Mare's convenience. But instead, they had dared to dissect the small familiar to uncover the secrets of witchcraft. That was something Sienna simply could not forgive. "Oh, I'm fine." He, Mare said from Sienna's side half-heartedly. The one who had led the dissection of Mare was the former master of the Green Tower. It was a past she didn't particularly wish to recall. Though thinking about it didn't cause her any significant distress. That was because Mare had not felt any physical pain during the dissection. Even so, she had still suffered a fair amount of psychological damage. She recalled feelings of humiliation and anger. It had happened over 100 years ago, but being dissected while fully conscious and alive was not an experience one could easily endure. "It's not fine with me," Sienna spat grimly. "The former head of the Green Tower? That bastard should be grateful he's already dead." Sienna had taken 3 disciples in the past during her time in Arath: Theodore Throne, Vice Osman, and Frilla Helen. Among them, Theodore became the head of the Red Tower while Vice and Frilla married. After Sienna retired as the Green Tower Master, Vice succeeded her. The child of the pair was Roland Osman, the father of the current head of the Green Tower, Generic Osman, and the one responsible for carrying out Mare's dissection. Sienna had never even heard of his name, but she was still filled with fierce anger. How had Vice and Frilla educated their child? How could he have even entertained the insane idea of dissecting a familiar belonging to his grandmaster? The royal family of Arath wasn't blameless in this matter either, since such a thing could not have taken place without their permission. "Stop immediately." By the time the palace gardens had become submerged in water, someone had shot up into the sky from a building within the castle walls. It was the commander of Aratha's court magicians, Tremple Vizardo and Melkith El-Haya. Melkith was currently bound. "Stop right now," I said. "Trying to submerge the royal palace of Abram? This was an unprecedented act of terrorism in the history of Arath." Tremple's hair stood on end due to his immense anger. "How dare you?" Tremple stared at the terrorists, no, the rebels, with wide, furious eyes. Despite not wearing a hood, their faces were not visible. It was a very high-level spell that was interfering with his perception. Tremple concentrated mana in his eyes and cast a spell. "Impossible. I never imagined I would encounter such a ridiculous situation during my time," shouted Tremple. He could see 3 adversaries at the moment, but there were bound to be more. It was impossible that a mere group of 3 was launching an attack against Arath. Was this a rebellion? Or was it an attack from another nation? Tremple was leaning towards the latter possibility. "Your spy, Melkith El-Haya, has already been captured. Halt your attacks immediately and—" "What are you saying? I've already told you I'm not a spy. I have no idea about any of this." Melkith screamed while squirming in the air. Eugene sighed at the sight. Tremple's rage and misunderstanding were understandable, but still he couldn't comprehend why he had captured Melkith and deemed her a spy. Tremple wasn't the only one who had flown up into the sky. Among the court wizards, 100 elite combat-specialized wizards rose into the air to block Sienna's path. Moreover, other wizards and knights were lining up on the ground, which was slowly being submerged in water. Well. It wasn't only their front and the ground that was slowly being lined with opposition. Wizards were beginning to gather in the back as well. They consisted of wizards of the capital, the heads of the towers, excluding Melkith and Balzac, as well as wizards belonging to the guild. They didn't rashly approach due to the magic ceiling formation around Abram, but they blocked Sienna's retreat path with determined resolve. "Is the king not coming out?" Sienna asked. The king in her memories would be long dead, but she still asked. To summon a nation's king like a common dog. Tremple felt a surge of anger and lifted his hand high. The staff that appeared with a flash absorbed Tremple's rage and mana. With a rumble, a whirlwind of intense mana began to form in the sky above Tremple's head. "It seems the crown prince is here, though." "Lady Sienna," Eugene whispered to Sienna, tilting his head slightly. It was Crown Prince Honian Abram. His face was distorted by confusion and anger as he approached Tremple. "Why are you suddenly being formal?" Well. I see." Sienna stopped herself and cleared her throat awkwardly with understanding. It wasn't yet known to the world that Eugene Lionheart was the reincarnation of Hamel. Hence, Sienna could not treat Eugene as Hamel in a public space. This might be nice. It'll be like a secret romance. Sienna entertained the thought for a moment but quickly composed her expression, reminding herself that this wasn't the time for such feelings. "You all," said Sienna. Her voice carried mana. A powerful vibration resonated through the air as her voice echoed, amplified by Akasha and the Eternal Whole. Tremple stiffened when he saw how easily his spell was deflected. A voice capable of unsettling the very foundations of magic? Was it possible? Was this a realization of Draconic, the legendary magic of the dragons? Could it be? Dragon. How had he missed it? What other existence was capable of ignoring the magic ceiling formation which the wise Sienna had left behind? What other existence was capable of causing the mana in the air to fluctuate with just their voice? After all, why did they assume that such an entity had to be human? Were they against a dragon, an entity who had vanished since the era of the wars? Tremple swallowed hard, his voice hardly above a whisper. Are you a dragon? Those words sent a significant shockwave throughout the crowd. The court wizards, headed by Tremple, hardened their faces in shared suspicion. Crown Prince Honian also appeared as if he had been struck hard from behind, his mouth hanging open. Even the beleaguered ground forces echoed with groans of discomfort. The tower heads responsible for the rear defense had also heard Tremple's words. Like Tremple, the Green Tower Master and the Blue Tower Master suspected the mysterious entity to be a dragon. Yet the face of Lovelian, the Red Tower Master, was locked with a different emotion. Could it be? The interference from the perception-altering magic was too strong. Moreover, the magic ceiling formation made direct intervention difficult. With narrowed eyes, Lovelian stared at the trio sinking Abram into the water. A single possibility spun in Lovelian's mind, growing steadily into a conviction. But the terrifying truth was something Lovelian couldn't bring himself to voice. A dragon, what nonsense. Sienna furrowed her eyebrows and shook Akasha. The perception-altering magic disappeared, and the obscured figures now appeared more distinct. Too much surprise could render one incapable of even being shocked, unable to utter even a groan or a cry of surprise. This was the state of the hundreds of people now looking at Sienna. Their eyes were wide and jaws agape as they stared at her. They knew from portraits that captured the past as well as statues across Pentagon. The unmistakable image from 300 years ago was still hanging in Akron. Her attire had changed. The clothes and the cloak were different. But her violet hair and akasha, which she held in one hand, were identical to the image from 300 years ago. Sir Eugene? Tremple managed to stutter out a few words, barely squeezing out his voice. Thanks to the disappearance of the perception-altering magic, Eugene's figure was also visible now. He had called Eugene's name because he felt more comfortable calling him than calling out Sienna Meridian. But uttering Eugene's name did not change the situation or what they saw. Tremple couldn't even think to calm himself. He could barely move his eyes. The wise lady Sienna, is it really you? He called out. Can't you tell? Sienna retorted while raising a finger high. All 100 court wizards stepped back in unison at her simple movement. Prince Honian was no different. Unsure of what to do, he alternated between staring at the sinking Abram and Sienna. Are you not going to dismiss it? Said Sienna. Excuse me, responded Tremple. I said, aren't you going to dismiss it, kid? Sienna yelled angrily while pointing at the magical vortex that Tremple had conjured. Without a moment's hesitation, Tremple instantly dispelled the magic and lowered his staff. No, thinking that it would be rude to hold a staff in her presence, he also dispelled the staff and respectfully held his hands at the navel. It's an honor to meet you. My name is Tremple Vizardo. I currently serve as the chief court magician of Eret. Tremple found it difficult to steady his trembling voice. To all wizards after the Age of War, the wise Sienna was practically a religion. Almost all wizards used the circle's formula. The formula established by Sienna was the backbone of the basics for the wizards of this age. The maxims she left were sacred scriptures, and Sienna herself was an idol akin to a god. Eugene! Melkith screamed. She was still confined, wriggling like a caterpillar, squealing. Help me. Lady Sienna. My name is Melkith El-Haya. I also played a big role in finding you. Melkith respected the wise Sienna as well. But unlike Tremple, she was not nervous or terrified. Rather, she was very confident. Who had freed Sienna sealed in the World Tree? Eugene Lionheart? No. It was everyone who fought alongside Eugene in the forest at the time. In fact, if Melkith hadn't supplied her mana, the battle with Raizakia would have ended with Eugene's death long ago. Sienna didn't immediately turn her attention to Melkith's desperate cry. With a grimace, Sienna listened to Mare's whispering. Lady Sienna, that's the guy. The bastard with the beard and the green robe. Aha. That guy is Generic Osman, the current head of the Green Tower. The guy who dissected me was his father, but he died decades ago. Aha. But you know, Lady Sienna. As I told you yesterday, that Generic bastard also tortured me a lot. Whenever he came to your hall, he would tell me that I was useless. He said he couldn't interpret witchcraft because I was useless. That's a bastard talking nonsense, Sienna said furiously. Yes, really. He couldn't understand witchcraft because he was stupid and incompetent, so why did he scold me? I'm really curious about that. I'm very curious too. Sienna nodded while stroking Mare's head. So I'll ask him directly. You don't have to go that far. No, I really want to. With that, Sienna turned towards Tremple and Honian. Stay there. Yes. Don't interfere and mess things up, just stay there. She didn't wait for an answer. Sienna raised Mare in her arms, then handed her over to Eugene. Mare giggled the entire time. Ahem. Just stand there holding Mare. Be still, won't you? It was a simple sentence, but it seemed to tickle her throat. Sienna coughed a few times and turned around. Hey. She turned her fierce gaze towards Generic. Generic was still floating in the air without any understanding of his current predicament. Come here. Oh, never mind. Just stay there. Yes. Stay there, you bastard. Anger and desire for slaughter turned into magic. Chapter 316. Abram 3. Generic's lips and eyes twitched uneasily. The wise Sienna. The legendary wizard was manifesting clear hostility as she slowly approached him. But why? Though the answer to his question seemed quite obvious, Generic still mulled over the question again and again. The reason. The biggest thing had been his father's mistake. So to Generic this felt incredibly unfair. His father and predecessor, the previous Green Tower Master, had been a stubborn and radical man. His father had insisted that interpreting witchcraft, the heritage of wise Sienna, was an absolute necessity they could waste no time with. Witchcraft, known as the grimoire of fantasy, was more of a concept in Akron than a book itself. What deserved attention was that Akron's witchcraft was divided into 3 parts. One volume was in Akron and the second, albeit a copy, was held by the royal family of Aroth. In reality, the remaining 2 volumes of witchcraft did not exist, and the magical book possessed by the royal family was nothing more than something Sienna had casually made to boost the royal family and Aroth's value. But since only Sienna knew this truth, future wizards had no choice but to be obsessed with the illusion of finding and deciphering the remainder of witchcraft. The previous Green Tower Master had harbored a strong desire for honor. He longed to interpret Akron's witchcraft, to get permission to study the remaining volume of witchcraft from the royal family, and to leap beyond the 8th circle. So he had insisted on dissecting Mare, a familiar who couldn't feel pain. It wasn't like they were completely breaking Mare apart, simply opening and closing her body a few times. In fact, there had been others who had entertained the thought before him. High-ranking wizards accessing Akron, the Tower Masters, and even the royalty of Aroth had thought that if some secret was hidden in witchcraft, dissecting the familiar that managed it would be more efficient. Dissecting the familiar was overwhelmingly easier than prying open witchcraft, which reproduced the concept of the eternal whole. But they had only entertained the thought without ever attempting to put it into action. Like witchcraft, the familiar Mare was also a legacy left by Sienna. They had been stuck at this impasse when the Green Tower Master of the generation claimed that he would take all the responsibility and requested to perform the dissection. Justification? He had plenty. The Green Tower Master had been the child of 2 disciples of the wise Sienna, and he had claimed himself to be Sienna's successor. The Red Tower Master of the generation, who had also succeeded Sienna, vehemently opposed, but the royal family of Aroth had accepted the Green Tower Master's proposal. All of this happened 100 years ago. So they dissected Mare, but there wasn't much gain. They wouldn't dare touch the fully sealed memories, and even the structural formula of the familiar was incomprehensible. From the start, there was no secret about witchcraft implanted in Mare. No matter how many times they performed the dissection, they couldn't have possibly gained anything. Lady Sienna, there seems to be a misunderstanding, Generic stuttered. But Sienna didn't give an answer. Generic thought her silence was a blessing. He had blurted out what he could, but even upon reflection, there was nothing for her to misunderstand. The act that angered you, Lady Sienna, was something my father committed. I have no connection to that incident. Changing his tone, Generic vehemently protested his unfair treatment. Of course, Sienna paid no mind to his pleas. Crack. A magical spear materialized beside Sienna's head. Without warning, the spear shot forward. Startled, Generic blinked away. If he hadn't, the spear would have skewered his head. Did I not? The spear came to a halt right where Generic had been standing, and Sienna sneered, "Tell you not to move? It. What? I told you just now, didn't I? Would I have really killed you? I was going to stop it myself, but you got scared and moved on your own. Isn't that right? Lady Sienna, about that. Don't get me wrong. I have no intention of punishing you for the sins your father committed. That was a lie. But that doesn't mean I have a reason to think well of you. You tortured Mare, didn't you? That is. And you've been parading around claiming to be my successor? I heard your name for the first time today, yet you've been profiting off mine over and over again." There was rage concerning Mare. However, it was irrational to direct it at Generic, so a different reason was necessary. Fortunately, there were plenty of reasons for Sienna to discipline Generic. And as if that wasn't enough, what about when you opposed Eugene's inheritance of Akasha? You were the most outspoken about it, weren't you? Shot Sienna. That was so abrupt that. Abrupt? And who are you to judge that? Of course. You can oppose it. That's fine. But, not only that, but you claimed to be my rightful successor and tried to take Akasha from Eugene. You tried to test Eugene, didn't you? She continued. Generic swallowed hard. Sienna raised Akasha high with a show of force. So, this time I will test you. To see if you're truly a worthy wizard to claim my succession. How could I possibly stand against you, Lady Sienna? This is too cruel. Cruel? Then I'll make you a clear bet. If your magic so much as grazes my clothes, I swear on everything to acknowledge you as my successor. I'll forgive your late unknown father for using my name for his benefit. I'll even forgive you for tormenting my beloved familiar. And right, Akasha? I'll give it to you too. Sienna grinned, her lips curling in amusement. As she laid out her terms, Generic's expression began to shift. He was still shocked and bewildered, yet avarice gradually filled his eyes. To merely graze her clothing? It didn't seem a difficult condition. The opponent was the legendary wizard, the wise Sienna, but she was still a human wizard. Just a graze. If he could accomplish that, Generic would gain a great deal. He would become recognized as the successor to the wise Sienna and master of Akash. He would receive all honor and glory. Even the wise Sienna could not renege on her words after declaring it in front of so many people. Generic slowly nodded while calming his heart and took up the challenge after a prolonged silence. Understood. If it means being recognized as Lady Sienna's successor, I, Generic Osman, will undertake the trial. As the current master of the Green Tower and a wizard who carries on Lady Sienna's legacy, declared Generic. You talk a lot, Sienna tilted her head with a chuckle. Well, are you not going to use magic? You're not planning on letting me attack first, are you? Generic's expression hardened at her words and he drew his staff. Perhaps it was because he'd decided to challenge her with magic, despite calling it a test. Sienna's outspoken words were beginning to grate on him. Let's put her in her place. Generic's body plummeted downwards. He had no need to ponder which magic to use. Out of all the magic he could perform, he opted for his most outstanding spell. His signature, the symbol of an arch-wizard, Yggdrasil. Light surged from Generic's staff, and the enormous glow engulfed his form. Sienna watched from above, her feet planted firmly in midair. What a fucking stupid spell, she criticized with narrowed brows. The concept of a signature spell had existed centuries ago as well. Today the standard for an arch-wizard was set at the 8th circle. But before the circle magic formula was properly developed, anyone and everyone had claimed to be an arch-wizard. From long ago, wizards were obsessed with unique spells that only they could perform. In that era, to distinguish a real arch-wizard, one had to display such unique magic. Their signature. Times sure have changed. To think that one could claim to be an arch-wizard with such a mediocre signature, said Sienna. He was sincere. In some ways, it could be considered the downside of the circle magic formula. Since the 8th circle had become the definitive standard, even those casting such mediocre spells could claim to be an arch-wizard as long as they were at the 8th circle. So what was so mediocre about it? First off, its activation was too slow. Something was earnestly being formed within the light, but the process was sluggish and full of gaps. The light itself served as a protective barrier, but Sienna could shatter it and tear Generic apart right this moment if she wished. She couldn't help but admire his judgment for opting to use such a slow signature without a second thought. Was he taking the test too lightly? Or did he believe his signature would be completed before his defenses were broken? Either way, it was shallow and unworthy. An unnecessarily large tree. The constituting formulas are quite interesting actually. The spells used to form Yggdrasil were mostly original magics from Generic and the Osman family. Sienna narrowed her eyes, intently observing the light spreading below. Asha would lay out the formulas constituting Generic's magic and allow comprehension by the user. However, Sienna succeeded in perfectly deciphering and understanding Yggdrasil without even needing to rely on Akasha. Acceleration and simultaneous casting of magic. This is a pathetic attempt at mimicking Eternal Whole. It was insignificant. Every single bark of the tree is imbued with a defensive spell. He's half merged his physical form with the tree to enhance his regeneration. He can escape by shifting to other roots as well. It was insignificant. He has dominion over the earth where roots are planted. The range is stupidly wide, but the assistance for precise calculation is severely lacking. Are you planning to compensate for the lack of precision with an inflated size and numbers? It was insignificant. Blossom buds on every branch. They're meant to gather mana from the air. The petals then burst to release the artillery. It's a wide area magic reflecting artillery off the petals. It was genuinely insignificant. It was truly trivial. He had just slapped on everything that was supposed to be great, but none of it was complete. This magic is just a coward's attempt to look brave. There was no real defense, evasion, or attack to present. How should she crush this then? The light vanished, signaling the completion of Yggdrasil. A magical tree as gigantic as the spire of the castle had sprung up from the lake. From deep within the tree, Generic opened his eyes. How long had it been since he'd been given the opportunity to fully unleash Yggdrasil like this? Delighted in his sense of omnipotence, Generic turned his attention towards Sienna. There was no need to look up at the sky since the tall and massive structure of Yggdrasil allowed him a wide field of view. Thank you for waiting. She must have failed to break through. Generic chuckled lightly while moving Yggdrasil. For countless tree roots and trunks sprung upwards from underneath the lake. With every movement of Yggdrasil's tendrils, giant waves rolled across the lake. I regret that I cannot concede the first attack to you, Lady Sienna. So I shall initiate the attack. Absolutely insane, Sienna muttered. Sienna scoffed and shook her head. The arrogance in that voice, confidently boasting about a not-so-impressive, insignificant magic, was too intolerable. Fine. Come at me, kid. Sienna expressed her intense annoyance. Yggdrasil invoked its magic. High-speed offensive spells poured onto Sienna in swarms, but Sienna stood still. There was no value or need to evade such magic. The attacks she was bombarded with consisted of different types of offensive magic, yet when they reached Sienna they all met the same fate. Annihilation. Pure annihilation. The attacks, the magic, faded into nothingness. What on earth? A wide-range dispel? It was the magic sealing spell. It was well known that the wise Sienna had indulged in magic sealing spells, which nullified an opponent's magic and stripped them of their magical ability. It was her specialty. Next, Sienna uttered. What kind of magic was it? Generic could only feel confusion and doubt. For dozens of roots, no less thick than the tail of Rhyzakia, pounced on Sienna all at once. The Eternal Whole was activated. Sienna bent her finger slightly and extended her left hand forward. The space around Sienna began to distort and shake. Crush. The trajectories of the roots aiming for Sienna were forcibly altered. What's this? The twisted trajectory wasn't the end of it. The roots that had entered the distorted space tangled with each other and twisted themselves into a knot. Generic was taken aback and tried to retract the roots, but even that didn't go as planned. Crack, crack. The entangled roots pressed against each other and flattened. But eventually the agglutinated mass broke and fell down below. Generic could not comprehend the spectacle before his eyes. The scene before his eyes wasn't the result of any magic sealing spell. Generic had full control of Yggdrasil, yet the control slipped away immediately when the tendrils entered the space around Sienna. Next, repeated Sienna. An idea arose in Generic's mind. There was a faint possibility. No, it was impossible. No matter how great the wise Sienna might be, there was no way such a thing could be possible. The expansive branches shuddered in unison. Hundreds of buds turned their heads towards Sienna. He had not yet gathered sufficient power, but Jen-Erik wanted to verify the idea he had conceived. Buds yet to bloom burst open, and as many petals embroidered the surrounding space. Thin threads were drawn between the fluttering petals, and the lasers pierced everything they touched as they reflected between the petals. It was impossible to predict their trajectories. No matter how fast they moved, the repeated reflections would inevitably impale their target in the end. Sienna chuckled and flicked her finger. Whoosh! The distortion spread even further, eating away as it expanded its sphere of influence. The moment the reflected lasers entered the space, their trajectory changed, similar to the tendrils from before. Boom! The redirected lasers collided with other beams and caused an explosion. But it wasn't over yet. Sienna entered the space she had created, then pointed her finger toward the scattering petals. A beam of light shot from her fingertip and made contact with a petal. Just as with Yggdrasil, the beam of light was reflected by the petals. Hundreds of petals floating in the special space were redirected as the path of the reflected beam. The petals were destroyed the moment they reflected the light. A single beam of light had destroyed hundreds of petals in the blink of an eye. By the time it had destroyed all the petals, the beam of light was no longer thin. It had grown large enough to blast a gaping hole in Yggdrasil. It was too fast and its power was incalculable. In shock, Jen-Erik shifted his position. Crack! The colossal tree crumbled. Jen-Erik, who had moved to another route, hid silently in the lake without erecting a new tree. He simply could not understand. The light that had just pierced the tree had been guided by Yggdrasil's petals. Was she making use of another wizard's magic as she pleased? The beam of light had easily penetrated through the layers of protective spells he had cast. No, instead, it felt as if his defenses had voluntarily thinned. It was as if Sienna was dominating his magic. "Your signature is shoddy," said Sienna as she looked down at the lake. Finding Jen-Erik among the many roots spread out at the bottom of the lake wasn't difficult for her. There were plenty of ways to break it, but this seemed the best way to trample on your petty pride. What did you do exactly? You think I don't have a signature of my own? Don't tell me you thought the eternal hole was my signature. No one would dispute it if the eternal hole was claimed to be a signature, but it wasn't Sienna's signature. Her signature was named Empress Rule. This magic worked in a space defined by Sienna, taking control of any other spell in that space. In simple terms, if the magic being cast was inferior to Sienna's, it was easy for her to take and she could control it at will. Yggdrasil? Signature? Such an ambiguous, vague magic. She had even figured out the formulas through Akasha, so what couldn't she control? Sienna chuckled and moved her finger. It drew a line through the air and magic bullets as small as grains of sand appeared in the air. What followed was a one-sided onslaught. The sand-sized bullets tore through Yggdrasil. She allowed him to flee here and there, gave him a little time to recover and then repeated the process. She gave him opportunities to resist before trampling on him repeatedly. Later she even wrapped the roots of Yggdrasil in streams of lake water and threw him into the air. She didn't allow him to escape. She cut off his retreat, broke his shell and dragged Jen-Erik out. Arg! Jen-Erik's body was propelled high into the air before falling back into the lake. Splash, splash, splash. Waves of water continued to raise a cloud of spray until Jen-Erik finally lost consciousness. Chapter 317, Abram 4. A thoroughly soaked through Jen-Erik was hoisted into the air. His limp form resembled the freshly laundered clothes hanging on a line. He was an archwizard of the 8th Circle. He was the patriarch of the Osman family, which was renowned even in Arath as a noble house of magic, a family that had produced 3 generations of the Green Tower Masters. Such a wizard had been treated like a child. He had been humiliated through and through. Although Jen-Erik wasn't highly regarded among the archwizards of Arath, there was not a single wizard who could boast that they were strong enough to toy with Jen-Erik as Sienna had done. Hey! Sienna's demeanor did not change in the slightest compared to the beginning. The magic that Jen-Erik repeatedly used had failed to even brush against Sienna's clothes, let alone leave a scratch on her. With a sour face, Sienna looked at Jen-Erik and flicked her finger. Snap! A magic bullet as small as a bean burrowed into Jen-Erik's body. Bwag! As soon as he regained consciousness, Jen-Erik vomited a large volume of water. He had ingested too much lake water while repeatedly falling into and being pulled out of the lake. Vomiting in front of so many people. It would have been an impossible sight for the Jen-Erik under normal circumstances, but now he was in no state to worry about such things. Jen-Erik looked easily 10 years older after regurgitating water for a while. He raised his head laboriously, gasping for breath, and looked at Sienna. "Do you want to continue?" Sienna asked. It was a chilling question. Jen-Erik immediately shook his head, hiccuping. He had never felt such dreadful pain and helplessness in the 80 years of his life as he had today. His body, plunged into the lake more than a dozen times, ached and throbbed all over, and it felt as if his bones and organs were also bruised and injured. He was dizzy from drinking too much water, and in particular, his eyes hurt as if they were about to burst. His ears were stuffed and ringing. However, it wasn't only the physical pain that had been inflicted on him. His heart had also been shattered into pieces. He was left with not even a grain of confidence in him. The wise Sienna. He had assumed she would be powerful, but how could the difference between them be so great? All of his confidence as a wizard, which he had polished and gained after half a century of training and studying, crumbled like sand. "All right," Sienna stared at Jen-Erik with half-closed eyes as she spoke. "I do not acknowledge you or your family as my successors. In the future, if you and your descendants claim to be the successors of Sienna Meridian, I will exterminate your family with my own hands. Yes. Who knows, maybe I'll be dead in that distant future. But if I die, well, my descendants will take care of your family, won't they?" With these words, Sienna turned her gaze to Eugene. Sienna Lionheart. Or Eugene Meridian. Either way was fine. She thought that both names held a thrilling allure. Well, that's a matter for the future. For now. Sienna's gaze fell upon Eugene and Mare. Though she hadn't beckoned them verbally, the intent in her eyes was clear. Eugene approached Sienna while cradling Mare. "I believe you owe an apology to my formal successor and my adorable familiar," said Sienna. The wrinkles on Jen-Erik's face quivered violently. An apology concerning Mare? He had already given one several years prior. But back then the apology had been made in a secluded space, far from prying eyes. Jen-Erik belatedly realized how considerate Eugene had been of him at that time. But now there were many spectators. The court wizards, knights, and officials from the palace were also present. Behind him were the tower masters, wizards belonging to the towers as well as those belonging to the guilds. A crowd of curious onlookers was also present on the far side of the lake. He did not want to do this. He was to lower his head and apologize in front of the vast crowd, in front of his rival tower masters, and in front of the wizards from the Green Tower. Though the idea felt revolting to him, Jen-Erik wasn't given a choice. He was too terrified of Sienna to offer any resistance or negotiation. "I apologize for the harm, my deceased father, caused to Lady Sienna's familiar." "You've also inflicted harm," retorted Sienna. "Yes. I apologize for that as well." "Why are you apologizing to me?" "You should apologize to her," said Sienna while receiving Mare into her arms from Eugene. She glared at Jen-Erik with wide eyes and Mare mirrored her. "I am sorry. And to my successor as well." Standing beside them, Eugene was taken aback by Sienna's relentless and harsh demeanor. Jen-Erik was on the brink of tears, and it was a pitiful sight. Jen-Erik's breaths grew rough as if he was hyperventilating. Clutching his chest, he managed to utter the words stutteringly. Eugene Lionheart. I sincerely apologize for refusing to recognize you as Lady Sienna's successor and for daring to test you." "Yes. I understand." Eugene nodded in acceptance of the apology, and Jen-Erik released a long sigh. Being drenched in water, Jen-Erik felt incredibly cold. Inside his chest was a deep chill and sorrow that may or may not be related to his being drenched. Keeping an eye on Sienna, Jen-Erik cautiously asked, "Hey, I depart now?" Yes. As of today, there should be no dissatisfaction or issue between you, me, and your family, correct?" said Sienna. "Yes. Going forward, behave appropriately. As I mentioned earlier, if you ever misuse my name by claiming to be my successor, you'll truly meet your end." Jen-Erik gave a deep bow, then turned away. As he lifted his gaze, he was met with an overwhelming number of eyes on him. The eyes that fell upon him were largely full of pity but not without their share of mockery. The wizards from the Green Tower in particular looked utterly despondent. Their eyes were filled with desolation and doubt. Some wept openly as if the reality of the situation was too shameful and humiliating to bear. Should I retire? Generic wondered. He felt as if he couldn't face the world anymore. His original plan had been to remain as the head of the tower for at least another decade before passing the position to his son, but now it seemed utterly impossible. In a few days I will be visiting the Green Tower. After all, even though it's been some time, it is the tower where I once resided, Sienna declared, causing a ripple of reactions among the wizards. Generic was hunched in despair and she didn't care about him. Moreover, she wouldn't have usually cared about the wizards' reactions, but she couldn't help but soften her heart after seeing the expressions of the Green Tower wizards. Upon hearing Sienna's words, the wizards of the Green Tower seemed relieved. Their tower master might have been humiliated, but the prospect of meeting the wise and revered Sienna was an exciting event for any wizard. "Excuse me, Lady Sienna," Eugene began, tilting his head towards Sienna. "The Red Tower Master has been a great help to me. I learned magic from him and his assistance was crucial during our previous endeavor. This seemed like the perfect moment to lend a helping hand to Lovelian." Sienna nodded, hearing Eugene's words. "The head of the Red Tower. His name is?" Yes. It's Lovelian Sophies." Lovelian stepped forward in surprise after suddenly being singled out. He alternated between looking at Eugene and Sienna with a confused expression. Although Eugene had prearranged a meeting with Sienna on the 30th day since the battle with the Black Dragon, Lovelian had not been privy to the exact date. Even so, he had still been somewhat expectant. Apart from the sudden snow, there was no other wizard capable of submerging Abram in water except the wise Sienna. "You are from the lineage of Theodore Thorn?" Sienna inquired. Theodore Thorn was one of Sienna's disciples and had been the head of the Red Tower centuries ago. The one who taught magic to Lovelian was a disciple of Theodore, so in essence, this traced back all the way to Sienna. As such, Lovelian had claimed to be a successor of Sienna until now. "Yes. That is correct," Lovelian confirmed. He couldn't help but tremble when he recalled how Generic had been humiliated. He trembled at the thought of being put through the same brutal test. However, his fears were quickly assuaged when, unlike before, Sienna gave a gentle smile. "You have a commendable lineage," she said, not caring that, technically speaking, Generic had a more prestigious bloodline. "So, you have been of great help to my rightful successor, and given the complex web of relations, you are both my successor's master and my successor yourself. It's something I simply rambled on about." "I don't believe I can claim to be your successor," Lovelian began to protest. "What does it matter?" Sienna interjected. "Let's have a proper discussion about this when I visit the Red Tower." Lovelian's face brightened significantly. He bowed deeply while the wizards from the Red Tower behind him cheered joyously. "Let's go, my adorable successor," said Sienna. She quite enjoyed referring to Eugene as her successor in front of the crowd. While it was a tad disappointing that she couldn't publicly declare her relationship with the simpleton Hamel, she found the secret and the thrill of this current superficial relationship quite enticing. With a smug grin, Sienna patted Eugene's back. "Yes, Lady Sienna," Eugene responded before obediently following behind Sienna. Sienna levitated through the air, heading towards the court wizards who had been commanded to stay put. "Now let's see how much of it's under," said Sienna as she observed Abram. She simply ignored Tremple and Honian. Even while she had been disciplining Generic, Abram had continued to sink slowly. Now the palace gardens had already turned into a lake. "Lady Sienna," Honian stuttered, beads of sweat dripping down his face as he watched the gardens slowly fill with water. Please quell your anger." "Where's your father?" Sienna asked. Although she was casually referring to the king, neither Honian nor Tremple had any complaints. Even 3 centuries ago, the king of Aroth had always treated Sienna with the utmost respect. Aroth had developed into a powerful kingdom of wizards because Sienna had made her residence there. But even putting that aside, they had to be mindful of Sienna. Abram was sinking and the Green Tower master Generic had been pummeled mercilessly. Aroth wasn't blameless in his crime. The royal family had given permission for the dissection of the familiar, and they had freely made use of Sienna's name until now. The royal family of Aroth was to blame. His Majesty is waiting for you in the palace, reported Honian. Is he too scared to come out and is instead asking me to pay him a royal visit? Spat Sienna. Lady Sienna. Please. Honian fell to his knees without caring for dignity. Sienna shook her head in disbelief. What are you doing? You're not even kneeling on the ground but kneeling in the air? What does that accomplish? She asked. Please withdraw your wrath. No. You don't have to do it immediately, but please come with me to visit His Majesty first, pleaded Honian, lowering his head to the point where it almost touched the ground. In front of the numerous onlookers, this was a sight to behold. The Prince of Aroth kneeling. Sienna grimaced as she stared at Honian. Why wasn't the king showing himself? It was pretty obvious, really. Being publicly rebuked was not something a king could afford to display in front of his people. However, he couldn't risk offending Sienna either, so he had likely sent the crown prince ahead while he anxiously waited in the palace. Since the crown prince is going to such lengths, why don't we head inside? Suggested Eugene while looking at Honian. It wasn't as if they didn't know each other. Honian had provided all sorts of assistance to Eugene since his time in Aroth. When Eugene was caught up in the issue of Akron's access, Honian had personally vouched for his credentials. If my esteemed successor requests it, Sienna nodded as her lips twitched. Honian's expression brightened at her response. He felt deep gratitude for Eugene's help but made sure to keep his head bowed. Raise your head, Crown Prince. I'll show you some respect, and Aroth too, as it was my adorable successor's request. Let's go meet the pompous king, said Sienna. Yes. Thank you. Honian slowly raised himself, careful not to make any abrupt movements. Me too, Melkith shouted. She was still bound in shackles. Tremple, who had been restraining Melkith until now, was gaping at her. This outrageously boisterous woman dared to assert herself even with this atmosphere? Release me too, Lady Sienna. I admire and adore you, shouted Melkith. Lady Sienna, the White Tower Master, also provided a lot of help, Eugene said somewhat reluctantly. If it is a request from my brave and kind-hearted successor, Sienna responded. Tremple instantly freed Melkith. He felt slightly uncomfortable as he glanced at Sienna and Eugene. So he was her adorable, esteemed, brave and kind-hearted successor? It did feel like he was being toyed with, but at the same time, it wasn't entirely outrageous either. Well, if it's Eugene Lionheart. Tremple would have undoubtedly flaunted his disciple with pride if he had been like Eugene. He blankly gazed at Sienna and Eugene as they headed towards Abram with Honian, then hastily followed behind. He had no idea what would transpire at the palace and was terrified to imagine it. Unfortunately, he couldn't foresee anything good happening. The person who wanted to sink Abram entirely was still in a fury, despite having taken out her anger on the Green Tower Master earlier on. If she attacks His Majesty. Tremple had always admired and looked up to Sienna, but if she attempted to harm the king, he would stand against her even if it cost him his life. Tremple quietly resolved himself to his potential death. What did I just say? Contrasting with Tremple's dire situation and his resolve, Sienna was engaging in a moment of introspection while trying to keep her expression under control. Adorable, esteemed, brave and kind-hearted successor? She had spoken with the desire to flaunt, but now that she thought about it, every word she had blurted out had been quite embarrassing. It's all right. Mare's voice resonated within Sienna's mind. The familiar had sensed her embarrassment. There's no reason for you to feel embarrassed over such trivial words. But still, Sienna protested. Really? Mare assured her. If you knew what horrendous acts Lady Anise and Lady Christina committed in your absence, your remarks would seem child's play. Mare kept her thoughts to herself, unable to bring herself to voice them out aloud. They were far too disgraceful for Mare to articulate. Moreover, she honestly lacked confidence in accurately portraying the extent of their atrocities. And if she were to reveal them, she feared Sienna would obliterate the royal castle in her wrath. They placed their bosoms on his head and wore a victorious smile. How could she possibly put such a spectacle into words? Who currently wears the crown? Sienna asked. King Daendolf Abram, Eugene answered, to which Sienna scoffed and shook her head. The last king of Aroth I met was the 25th Lukid. The current king is the 31st in line. 31st? Time flies. Isn't it about time for the kingdom to be on the brink of collapse? Or for the royal line to be usurped? Said Sienna. The fear gripping Honian was palpable as he stiffened, and Tremple seriously contemplated whether an assassination attempt was in order. Please, Lady Sienna. Let's keep things peaceful and not be too harsh, Eugene pleaded. I successor. So you must have quite an attachment to this kingdom. You're even worrying for its fate, responded Sienna. Well, I am more concerned about you, Lady Sienna, said Eugene. Me? Why so? Asked Sienna, her eyes widening with surprise. If you act too brutally, history may tarnish your name. Instead of the wise Sienna, you could be remembered as the brutal Sienna. As someone who admires Sir Hamel, I believe that anything is better than being called the stupid Hamel like him. She had wondered what he was about to say. Her expression changed as she eyed Eugene. My dear successor, you may say such things because you know nothing about the old days. Hamel wasn't just stupid, he was a complete idiot. A complete moron. I've read the fairy tale. Stupid Hamel seems quite tasteful and appropriate. Ah, right, I see. However, don't you think Sir Hamel would cry in heaven if he found out about this? Retorted Eugene. Why would he cry? Dead men tell no tales, said Sienna. That cunning smile. Eugene trembled with clenched fists. Tremple and Honian fell silent at the sudden change in topics. They yearned to inquire about the legends and glory of 3 centuries past, but unfortunately, this was not the time for leisurely questions. We are here, said Honian, swallowing hard. They had flown through the waterlogged corridor into the palace and halted before the door to the throne room. His Majesty is inside. You haven't stashed an assassin or royal guards in there to get rid of me, have you? Said Sienna. Absolutely not. Honian cried out in surprise. Even so, he anxiously examined the area beyond the door. He detected no signs of the royal guard Sienna had mentioned. This unsettled him considerably. Normally, the royal guards and ministers lingered in the throne room, but aside from the king, there were no other discernible presences. Sienna noticed his confusion. Before Honian could cautiously knock, she stretched out her hand and the door swung open with a bang. We're coming in. She breezed past Honian into the room. This was Eugene's first time in the throne room of Aroth as well. However, he found no opportunity for admiration. King Daendolf Abram, the 31st king of Aroth, anxiously circled around his throne while nervously gnawing at his fingernails. He stopped in place at the abrupt opening of the door. What an honor to meet you, wise Lady Sienna, he cried out, his voice resonating throughout the room. It became clear why there were neither royal guards, ministers, nor even servants in the throne room. King Daendolf Abram shouted in a booming voice before dropping to his knees, prostrating himself on the floor.